our 7-part series entitled Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, the 5th anniversary of Pope Francis's climate encyclical Laudato Si, Reflections After 5 Years, Where We Are. Tonight we'll be addressing what is happening to our common home, the introduction in part 1 of the encyclical. I'm Jeffrey Burns. I am the director of the Harps Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, the Office of Mission for the University, and the Strategic Pathway for Care for Our Common Home. To enhance your viewing tonight, please put your view on speaker view so you'll be able to focus on our speakers. And secondly, you will be muted throughout the lecture. The questions and answers will be at the end of the lecture. We ask you to submit your questions through the chat function. You will then be identified and asked to unmute yourself and ask your own question. Pope Francis said in his encyclical, and I want to start this because yesterday was Ash Wednesday and I think this is appropriate. He wrote, "Sister Mother Earth cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her Lord and Masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth." And so as we keep that in mind, we will begin tonight with an invocation and an introduction by Dr. Michel Lovette-Colyer. Dr. Michel Lovette-Colyer is the Assistant Vice President and Director of University Ministry. He received his Master's in Divinity from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, and he received his PhD in Leadership Studies at the University of San Diego. He's been at USD since 2007. He's published a number of articles having to do with Catholic mission, and particularly cultivating compassion in undergraduate students. But most of all, he has been a tremendous presence here on campus at USD, providing a good example and model of what it means to be a culture of care. And so we welcome Michael tonight to begin our session on Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. Michael?
Thank you very much, Jeff. Welcome one and all. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for joining us tonight. Let's begin with a prayer. Praise be to you, our loving Creator. We praise you and thank you for the many blessings of our lives, especially the magnificent gift of creation. We ask you to help us slow down, to resist the frenetic pull toward materialism and consumerism, the temptation to always increasing productivity and efficiency. Slow us down so that we might instead see with new eyes and appreciate with greater depth the immense beauty by which we are surrounded. And in so doing, that we might recognize our inherent connection to every creature with whom we share this precious planet Earth. Praise be to you, our loving Creator. We praise you and thank you for the example of St. Francis. We ask you for the insight and the imagination that he had, for the awe and wonder he experienced, for his movement toward the excluded and the suffering, for his willingness to reorient his life in pursuit of what it means to be truly human. Praise be to you, our loving Creator. We praise and thank you for the brilliance of scientists, researchers, teachers, the wisdom of spiritual and religious leaders, the prudence of elected officials and civil servants, the vision of business women and men who are striving to make their companies more sustainable, the necessary contributions of all those who are helping us understand what is happening to our common home and what each one of us can do to care for it. Praise be to you, our loving Creator. We praise and thank you for the enthusiasm of our students, for the passion of the young, for their insistence that we address pollution, climate change, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, decrease in quality of life, and global inequality. Help us be inspired by them, to let their energy push us to overcome obstacles, resistance, denial, to find creative ways to elude the defenders of the status quo, to overturn the globalization of indifference, and to settle for nothing less than the future they deserve. Praise be to you, our loving Creator. During this season of Lent, help us to examine our lives, to identify the places in which we are unfree, unloving, ungenerous. Open our ears so that we may clearly hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And open our hearts so that we may truly take action to care for this earth and all those with whom we share it, especially the poor. Praise be to you, our loving Creator. Amen.
Amen.
Great, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Dr. Michel Boudrias. Dr. Budria has been at USD since 1996. He currently serves as the Associate Professor in Environmental and Ocean Sciences Department. And in addition, he is the chair of the department and the chair of the university's Sustainability Task Force. Dr. Budria earned his PhD from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UCSD. And he also has an MS from Oregon State University in biological oceanography. He teaches classes that cover a wide range of topics from introductory marine biology to interdisciplinary coastal environmental science to classical invertebrate zoology. He's taught honors classes that combine traditional classroom concepts with intense field experiences. Dr. Boudrias' research projects include long-term interdisciplinary projects combining marine ecology and marine chemistry in Baja California Sur, and an integrated project studying the social, cultural, and environmental impacts of tourism in Jamaica. He's the perfect speaker for us tonight as we look at Chapter 1 of Laudato Si, because his areas of expertise include climate change, environmental issues, pollution, water quality, marine ecology, and sustainability in Baja California and Jamaica. I've known Dr. Budria a long time, and in my opinion, he exemplifies everything that is good and right about USD. He's brilliant, humble, passionate, good-humored, and equally dedicated to his students as well as helping them prepare to address humanity's urgent challenges. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Boudrias. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Michael. There's just one correction because I was chair for a long time, but my chair is here supporting me. So we do it for a while. Sometimes we forget to change our biographies. I really am very honored to be kicking off the USD portion of this lecture series. I think we had such a spectacular start last week with Professor Ramanathan from Scripps, sort of setting the tone for the big picture. And what I'd like to do today is really focus on the messaging that we have in the encyclical, and really to talk about not only what is happening to our planet, but to really make sure we understand that there's a lot that we can do to also come up with solutions and be part of the group of people that are going to make this, that allow us to actually take care of our common home. So just to let you, before I put my slides up to share, I really want you to think about tonight's presentation as a story in 3 parts. I'm going to focus on what's really in Chapter 1, some of the really key statements that Pope Francis put out for us. That Laudato Si was such an important letter to the world. And I think there's some important statements there that all of us should take to heart and all of us should work on. So we'll start with the words of wisdom of Pope Francis. I will then transition to talking about our common home, what's going on, to talk a little bit about the science and the facts and what's going on our planet. But a story like this can never end with just those facts. We really have to have a message of hope. I think Ron started that concept last week. I think it's great that we will try to have this message of hope and solutions throughout our series. And so I'm going to end with some things that we can actually do to give us some of that power to be part of the solution to take care of our common home. So let me share my screen with you. Now, those of you who know me know how subtle I am. So you will notice that the vast majority of what you're going to see is also going to make you think about our planet. I've told my student this, that science communication is everything from what you say and what you wear. So my background is blue, my shirt is blue, my slides are blue and green. This is the planet. All of today is focused on what can happen to the planet. And our goal is how we can all care for our common home. Now, Michael pointed out that I've been an oceanographer and marine biologist for many, many years. So this is where I start. This is where I sometimes have to spend my life working on ecology around the world. But I use this as my intro because you might expect that as a marine biologist and oceanographer for 40 years, my hero would be Aquaman, who would protect our planet and protect the oceans. And he is a hero because in many ways, he sends a good message. But now that my children are grown, I don't watch these cartoons as much, but I also spend a fair amount of my time with another world hero, which was Captain Planet. And if you even remember this, one of the key rings was heart. So even in this fictitious world, it's not just science, it's really the people involved. But tonight is about a real hero who really changed how we think about things. And so I really want to focus on this really life-changing encyclical that was given as a gift to the world, and focus on the message from Pope Francis. I could have titled my talk, Everything is Connected, because that's really what Laudato Si does, but it's really what we need to do in order to be able to take care of a common home. And as summary of some of the things that are in there from the beginning, make it very clear that in Laudato Si, the interconnectedness is there. It's social justice, it's climate change, it's the fact that people are displaced from their homes, that food's been impacted, that labor sources have disappeared, that there are refugees here and abroad, and we need to do something about it. So one of the first quotes that I want to use is this one here, right, that makes it very clear from Pope Francis that the climate is a common good belonging to all and meant for all. And if you flip that coin and you ask who's at risk, the answer is clear. It's everyone, everywhere. Now, some will be more at risk than others, but it's really a global issue and something that we need to get outside of ourselves and think of others in order to really be powerful in our response to climate change. Climate change is a global problem with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of good. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity. Its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in coming decades. This is very early on in Laudato Si, establishing two key messages. The first is that climate change is real. It's a real problem happening now. It's not a debatable issue. It's a situation that's affecting the world in multiple ways. And the second of the three key messages is that it disproportionately affects the disadvantaged around the world, be they in our country or being in developing countries. And those are messages that recur throughout the Laudato Si encyclical. In fact, we do see a disproportionate effect on the disadvantaged. And for us to work on that, we need to cultivate the proper relationship with our neighbors, to be responsible for that relationship, to increase our relationship with ourselves, with others, with God, and with the earth. So it's very much a connection to the world and the people themselves. And the third key message is we have to do it together. That the urgent challenge is for our common home includes a common concern to bring all of humanity together, to seek sustainable integral solutions. And I looked at so many different pictures, and I was drawn to this one for two main reasons. One, it is a climate change protest, but climate justice is the cause, not just the fact that it's affecting us scientifically or environmentally, but it's affecting the people. And the second one is the champions of the future. There is such power in the next generation wanting to improve the planet as it is. I tell my students all the time that this is where I get my energy to move forward. And so I thought this image brought home the future leaders that are going to help us through this crisis. Finally, Pope Francis, not finally, but one of the other quotes I liked is, I urgently appeal for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human impacts affect us all. And then the final quote that I chose reconnects to the fact that it is our common home. And this analogy is, I think, quite powerful. Our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. And I know many of you in this room understand that this was an encyclical from a Catholic Pope, but this imagery of the mother embracing us crosses all kinds of religious and cultural barrier. The fact that we talk about Mother Earth, the fact that this is a system that says this planet is important to us and should be something that we protect and that we work together. And one of the real powerful messages I find in Laudato Si overall, but really established very early on in the introduction and in the first chapter, is the fact that this is a planet that we all must work on together. So the three messages to repeat: climate change is real, it's happening now, it's disproportionately affecting disadvantaged communities, but it's our common home and we need to work together and join together to come up with solutions. So this establishes, for me, the core and deep messages of Laudato Si, what's been driving me in working on care for a common home. Of course, the other half of my life is I'm a scientist who's looked at climate change and long-term ecological impacts. So even as someone who's studying tiny bugs living in the beach, looking at the effects of marine pollution, looking at how the environment changes over time, allows us to see what's climate change doing to the planet. So let's talk about that. This diagram puts in, really, I want you to look at it as three big boxes. The two small boxes in the center, in blue and in gray, are the physics and chemistry and biology of climate change. It's the greenhouse gases, the CO2 and the methane. It's the global warming itself, the temperature of the planet, and the physical impacts, the melting of glaciers, the impacts on oceans. And I want you to notice that the two bigger boxes are the human connections to this, the activities that lead to this, and the impacts to humans. So if you look at the activities, our fossil fuel burning, deforestation, urbanization, affecting land distribution, these are all things that affect strongly what's going on to the physics and chemistry of climate change. But look at how it's affecting us as humans. Increased casualties, the spread of diseases. Remember Zika just 2 years ago that was moving into Florida from tropical habitats because of some changes in temperature. Natural disasters. We ran out of letters of the alphabet this year for Atlantic hurricanes, right? Fishery and agricultural issues. And finally, environmental refugees. And I like to talk about that one because a lot of times we put it away. We know that some of the islands are disappearing. We know that maybe there's been some environmental refugees in other places. You may not know that some of the problems in Syria are a direct result of climate change issues that caused many of the people whose farms were now completely destroyed by drought to move into the cities. And this came directly from the military telling us that it exacerbated the political condition. But I want you to know that there's environmental refugees in our country. There are people who have lost their land. And to bring it home to the USD folks, one of our students who was an environmental studies major, a veteran who came back to school, was going back to Louisiana to farm his ancestral home, and some of the lands are gone for good. So these are real disasters happening to real people. So we really need to keep that in mind as we think about the impacts of climate change. So I told you climate change is real. I don't believe in climate change. I know it's happening. I'm a scientist and I analyze it from an objective perspective. So let's take a look at some of the data. This is a graph that shows the temperature anomalies comparing the year-to-year value to the long-term average between the 1800s and the year 2000. And if you look at this for those first 100 years of this graph, for the most part, it's either colder than average or just slightly warmer than average. But you start moving from 1980s, so 40 years ago, you can try to interpret this any way you want. The temperature is going up. It's going up quite rapidly, right? There is no trick to this data set, and it shows this, but maybe this drives it home even more. These are the 10 hottest years on record, and we can actually make a change. The data just came out about a month ago for 2020, and 2020 is just slightly cooler than 2016, therefore between 2019 and 2016. This means for everybody in this room, the 5 warmest years in the history of the planet have occurred in the last 5 years, and it's not stopping. And remember the Paris Agreement where they want to stop things at 1.5 degrees centigrade, we're already at 1.25. And we have way to go. We have 10 years to go to 2030 and 30 years to go to 2050. So this is the data that's been objectively analyzed. If you look at CO2, the famous Keeling curve, where the CO2 is measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory starting in 1958, you can see the very rapid increase in CO2. The jaggedness per year is the winter-summer differences, right? And for some of you who may be climate activists, you may recall that there was a big move 10 years ago to create 350.org and to have this whole movement, because 350 was going to be the tipping point. Well, we're way past 350, and in 2020, we averaged over 410 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if we look at the projections, it's only going to continue. Hopefully we can make some changes to our life, but I want to remind you, as Ron mentioned last week as well, that the CO2 in the atmosphere now is not what we're putting in today. It's been there for 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years. And so things that we did in the past are affecting it. There's been a little drop because of COVID, because we're not driving as much, not traveling as much, but that's not going to be visible for a long, long time. And especially if everybody recovers and gets back out there and starts driving and flying again. So look, the data's clear. Climate change is there, global warming is happening, and we're seeing those results in our world. What does that mean? What are those impacts? Well, let's look at some of the potential and real impacts, right? There's an expectation of over 250,000 people dying worldwide because of diseases related to climate change. Loss of water, pollution and increases of air pollution, therefore leading to more deaths due to problems in the air like asthma. A temperature rise that will disrupt precipitation patterns, including when it rains and how hard it rains. Let me remind you, if you recall, those of you who live in San Diego, in 2015, there was a weekend in July where we had a tremendous amount of rain. In fact, it was 2 inches of rain in that weekend in July. That was the equivalent of 100 years of rain. So we had a weird event. This is what's going to happen. These weird events where there's floods and then nothing for 10 years are going to become more frequent, right? Another way to look at impacts is just last year. This is a map from NOAA. We had $22 billion natural disasters last year in the United States that are related to climate change. The wildfires, the storms, the tornadoes, the hurricanes. Each one of these disasters cost more than $1 billion of economic damage, right? And some of these are going to be long-term. So when a hurricane devastates a port, you increase the pollution for years because you're releasing a lot of the pollution that was in the sediment. So these are events that are going to last for a long time. Visually, these are the kinds of things we see. Floods, massive tides that can affect structures. Floods in Vietnam in this case, droughts. I use this map of Australia because in 2012, they had to add a new color. They never had temperatures above 45 degrees centigrade. And now that's become a constant so that they now have to have a temperature range that's 45 to 50 degrees centigrade on their maps. And this has now become not a one-time thing, but a pretty current summer event. Or you look at polar bears where the ice is melting, droughts where the animals do not have enough food to eat, and melting glaciers. These are the images that drive home what the climate change impacts are. I could use pictures in the US across the country if we want to. Now, Pope Francis has some really great concepts in an encyclical because he talks about real life science impacts to people. And I'm going to use just 3 of them that are listed in chapter 1. One is about air pollution. I tried to find different cities. This is a picture of LA. And I remember when I was at Scripps where you can see the air. And the verbs see and air should not be in the same sentence. So when it's brown out there, that's not what I should be able to say. I saw the air from LA come down the beach, right? But air pollution is a problem. There are many deaths associated with that. You increase it with pollutants, but believe it or not, when you have very hot temperatures, our Santa Anas, for example, people that have COPD, people that have air asthma are in a position where there's more pollen in the air, it's harder to breathe, it's hotter, and you start seeing these problems. And Pope Francis talks about how our mismanagement of the planet is increasing air pollution, and it is particularly problematic in big cities and particularly problematic in poor countries. Water pollution, and I looked at a lot of pictures, and I know some of these are disturbing, but unfortunately real. Plastic everywhere. Rivers that have impacts of heavy metals that have been released from mines. Oil spills everywhere. This is an issue that's occurring everywhere. These pictures are from developing countries. This is from Colorado. So these are pictures that are coming from around the world where we're seeing an increase in water pollution, and the climate change impact on precipitation means it's less predictable and more difficult to work on. And one of the other ones that Pope Francis discusses is the loss of biodiversity. And when you think of biodiversity, you can think about the natural resources themselves, but you can think of the connections and the benefits, the fact that you may want to go outside and walk around and get some benefits of clean air and of hiking, or maybe food, or maybe other components that come from that. The fact that we, unfortunately, affect biodiversity by damaging the environment, and I just showed you some pictures of that. His connection is so clear. Each creature reflects something of God and has a message to convey to us. When you look at a turtle and you see them wrapped up in a plastic bag or with plastic around them, when you see fish and birds with plastics, a new paper just came out that virtually every fish has something like some parts of plastic. So you're eating plastic as you're eating your favorite seafood meal. This has now become common. This is a common problem on the planet. So we need to do something about it. So let me come back to this theme of interconnectedness, because really the solution means that we have to work together. That's the solution piece, right? We need to think, if we're a corporation of people, planet, and profits, all the pieces together. We need to look at from the sustainability pillars of environmental, social, and economic. From the academic side, bring the arts, the sciences, and engineering together, and the business school to work on solutions. Think about it from the perspective of peace and public health and environmental justice. Think of having science, politics to support your work, and the financing to make it go forward. So let's start talking about some solutions. And I got it set up in 3 different ways. I have a little bit on the world solution, one on the San Diego solution, and one to finish up on the USD solutions. So let's take this, for example, and I love this diagram as it covers the different aspects that we can talk about. If we take this positive perspective that we can make a difference in the next 10 years, right? We know that there's destruction of natural spaces. So let's put our efforts in restoring them and protecting natural habitats. Let's protect 30% and manage the rest. Let's make sure we recognize indigenous people and water rights. There's even a movement to give rights to rivers and make them something that we need to respect completely. What is this going to do? It's going to improve clean water for billions of people. It's going to allow our food to be produced in a much better way. What about if we reduce this catastrophic loss of species, this biodiversity that Pope Francis talks about? It is important to safeguard the diversity. One thing to do is to reduce, halt human-induced extinction. We are in our 6th mega extinction. The first 5 took millions and millions of years to complete. We're doing it in 10 to 100 years, This is a problem. It's in the decadal or 100-year scale. We have to find a way to reduce extinction, right? Stop unsustainable wildlife exploitation. It's going to increase the diversity of life. And you might say, oh, that's great. I like to have more butterflies, or I like to have this. But as you know, we are discovering so many secrets from nature, so many drugs that are saving humans, so many parts of the planet that really help clean our air and clean our water. So supporting biodiversity is very important. It'll help stabilize the climate. And what about unsustainable production and consumption? One of the messages that I did not add in my top 3, and Pope Francis has come back to this for several times, is that we have a world, a society of consumption. We buy a lot. We use resources once and throw them away. And we need to change our behaviors to help. So reduce our carbon footprint, reduce our consumption, start using more sustainable practices in the industries that give us our food, but in our infrastructure. You use different building materials instead of cement, come up with some alternative. Do things that reduce both the pure consumption of resources, but also the improper use of the resources. And this will just be good for everybody, right? Clean air and clean water is a right for all of us. It is not a political debate, and it's something that I think we should be doing our best to try to support. So let's bring it home. Now, you can imagine this is one of those great iconic San Diego shots. For you, it may not evoke much. When I give a talk in Cleveland in the winter, it really annoys them because I can tell them, this is what it looks like where I live, right? But in San Diego, we are connected to the outside world. If you walk the beaches, you surf, you hike, you go to the desert, you go to the mountains. We've actually found in our surveys that the vast majority of San Diegans understand the impacts to our natural environment. And in fact, we are seeing stresses to the environment. And I use this picture, it's one of my favorites because of the timing. This is the La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club. And in the room here are scientists from around the country working with NOAA on planning sea level rise resilience and mitigation as sea level rise comes over the wall and goes into the meeting room. So this is an example of the reality of climate change as it happens today. These beautiful beachfront properties are getting pounded and affected by sea level rise and increased storm surge. We also have to do it for future generations. It is critical for us to help improve and clean our planet, to take care of our common home for our children and our grandchildren and our nieces and nephews and the generations to come. So how do we do that? Well, let me give you an example of a project that I worked on with several colleagues at USD, colleagues at Cal State San Marcos and UCSF, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the San Diego Foundation. We had one of 6 grants funded by the National Science Foundation to work on climate education. And we said the way to move the needle, to get the people that are going to make a difference, we need to work with the decision makers. We need to bring the decision makers to the table and have them be part of the solution. And I won't go through everybody on this photo, but Ron Roberts, who was a good friend of USD and was the county commissioner, who just retired last year, and the former mayor and current mayor, or if you want, the former city council president, the former mayor and the current mayor, and USD alum. We brought Republicans and Democrats and independents. We brought everybody together because we had to have all the leaders on the same page. So what did we do? Well, first we interviewed them, and this is one of our problems in finding solutions. When we asked leaders if they were part of a community concerned about climate change, the answer said yes, 90% of them were. However, 90% of them said that they didn't think their peers were involved. So what you have is a topic not to be discussed, a place not to come up with a community-based solution to take care of your common home because you don't think that your colleagues, peers, political opponents are going to take to this. So we have to break this barrier. We have to get information to them, work together and be part of a community. So what we did is we created a series of resources that had 5 important things that had not been done before. One is we focused the science locally and regionally. We were able to get the top data that affected you right where you live. You may care very much about polar bears, but you care very much if your house in Del Mar is going to be underwater. So you need to connect to the science that's happening to you here. We translated the science to use infographics so that the science was well done, but it could open the doors to more conversations. We framed it with a concept of social psychology. We want people to know that they can do something. We connected to the fact that you are part of a community. And maybe more importantly, that this is a deeply held value. So think of the messages in Laudato Si, where it's really about your values of respecting others and working with people and the planet. And then, of course, we focus on community leaders, and that meant everybody from madres de familia, if you're working with the families at the border, to elected officials, to tribal leaders, to CFOs. The people who could make a difference and influence their communities. And again, we made sure there was a message of hope. What can you do? It's not just the science of climate change. The science of climate change is kind of depressing because things are not good right now. We need to get past that and focus on how we can solve the problem, how we could take care of our home and mitigate those issues. So here's examples of things we did. We talked about the predictions for temperature between now and 2050. We talked about the impacts of precipitation. And for the scientists in the room, you will notice I'm not using degrees centigrade. I'm using a language that every smart person can understand. I'm not talking to scientists, I'm talking to decision makers, to the general public. And it's important for us as scientists, when we talk to the public as part of coming up with solutions, to connect to our audience. So it's gonna get a lot warmer, it's gonna get a lot drier, we're gonna have more floods. We're gonna have about a foot of sea level rise, which doesn't seem like much until you add that foot to any of our big winter storms, to our El Nino events, to our king tides, and then many of the situations we have along the coast will be affected. I would point out, right, that at Big Sur, Highway 1 is gone. This happened to Carlsbad a few years ago. These are events that you need to think about when you're thinking about your community. We also took people somewhere. You can't just talk about climate change. You need to see it, you need to feel it in order to be able to want to do something about it. And then we gave them suggestions. This is for water. Each one of the major impacts had 4 to 6 ideas of things you can do. That's the I can piece, right? And then we did this by having ambassadors, so mayors talking to mayors, really getting this community together. That third point from Laudato Si, that the community needs to work together to come up with the solutions, was a core component of what we did. So did it work? Well, the answer is yes. If you look at the data now with slightly more detail, we had 90% who believed they were part of the community, and when we redid it, it was 87%. So they believe that. We had different people, by the way. We had more people we interviewed. And then instead of having only 10% thinking that their peers cared about climate change, the definitely yes was at 17%, but the definitely and somewhat yes made it 77%. So our 5 years of working with the leaders meant that they saw the advantage of doing something. And that, I think, is one of the messages we need to take from this is we need to be diligent in our work, patient in our work, and make sure that we get our team members together. Whoops. All right, so what about USD? What about the interconnections at USD? And let's finish our story tonight. Well, first, let's focus on our vision statement. Michael and I worked together, in fact, on Care for a Common Home as part of the strategic plan. Dr. Harris put together a team. Some of you are in the audience today. And we came up with a tagline that we should really focus on, that is, the world needs change makers. That's who our students are, that's who our faculty and staff are, and we just need to give them the power to do more of it. But I want you to point out that our university has a few really key components here. Setting the standard for an engaged contemporary Catholic university. Following the message of Laudato Si fits beautifully in that component. But it also means we need to be the ones that other universities want to follow. We need to develop these innovative change makers to come up with new solutions. And we need to do it and confront humanity's urgent challenges. A statement that comes directly from Laudato Si, where Pope Francis talked about climate change and this affecting the world. And it means working together. So we have 6 pathways that are that work together. Anchor institution, focusing on the community, access and inclusion, increasing our diversity on campus, getting our faculty engaged to do work that is beyond just the wonderful academic work, but connect to the community, connect to practical solutions. Care for a Common Home, our theme for tonight, practice change making, and really the heart of our university is the liberal arts, but move the liberal arts to this 21st century to be connected to the issues of today and be innovative in the way we train our students. What does it mean for Care for a Common Home on campus? It means we're going to encourage and enact care for all of creation by following the call of Laudato Si, by doing classes in a different way, by doing research in a different way, by changing and enhancing our campus culture, by reinforcing our community partnerships. It means that we need to think about Care for a Common Home on our campus as a model for how to follow the messages of Laudato Si by putting it everywhere in our faculty and student interactions, in our community engagement, in how we deal with the finances and operation of our university, our endowment, our investments in the community from a financial perspective, our support of students and local communities. So I see at least 4 things we should continue to do. We need to message our campus, let them know what we do, tell our story, bring them in, and be part of our team. We need to change our policies to make sure that USD is the standard for Care for a Common Home and Laudato Si. We need to continue, because we've already done a really nice job of this, to facilitate engagement. We have campus as a living lab where our students are working with their faculty members to work on solutions for campus. We have strategic initiatives that have supported some really wonderful programs that connect to Care for a Common Home. And we need to support our efforts at all levels so that Care for a Common Home becomes who we are, what we do, and how we change the future. So the message of the Pope is clear. Climate change is real. It's happening today. It's affecting everyone. And we need to make sure we work together. And we need to make sure we leave a planet for future generations that we could be happy for them to live on. And I started with quotes from Pope Francis. I'm going to finish with a quote from John Lewis, who I think connects very much the same way. When we take our air, waters, and land for granted, when we show a simple lack of respect for nature and our environment, we unmake God's good creation. Humanity is the most important endangered species under threat, from climate change, and yet we flood our ecology with poisons and pollution. It is my belief that our country needs better environmental protections and that the real protections don't have to come at the expense of jobs or your economy, whatever you do to the earth. Now I can't see the bottom of my quote. Anyways, you see the rest of my quote. I can't see, it's covered by my sharing step. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and it's open for questions that Michael will put together.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. Wonderful presentation, really appreciate that. So this is a time, it's a wonderful opportunity for all of us who are gathered together to put some questions forward for Dr. Budria. So please go ahead and type those into the chat. And while you're doing that, maybe I'll kick us off because there's a question on my mind, which is, it's 5 years on since the publication of Laudato Si. So I wonder, Pope Francis identifies pollution, climate change, biodiversity loss, water issues. Are there any other issues, that 5 years later you think should be included in that list when we think about what's happening to our common home that we should be thinking about and aware of?
That's a really great question, Michael. Those come to the forefront because they're the ones that really affect so many people. Food is clearly one that I think needs to be looked at very carefully. And related to food, because even Pope Francis mentioned this, that the distribution of resources, and this is why it's important to bring all the expertise together, right? When you think of the supply chain of, if we produce food and we get rid of it, could we not think about ways to be more efficient at producing it and getting it? We waste 30 to 40% of the food that's made. And that's something that it comes up all the time. And it's even worse now with COVID as we see people. So agriculture practices and food distribution and food waste is a topic that's risen very much to the forefront in addition to the ones that you've mentioned. They are interconnected because there's a water impact and there's a water pollution impact. But I think food would be the one I'd bring up as an additional one.
Thank you. Yeah, I noticed that it's in the encyclical that 1/3 of all food produced goes to waste. Just unbelievable.
Yeah, for reasons that are really crazy. So for example, USD has done some really good things in that space. One of the things we do is, and I love this acronym, we use UBUs, which means ugly but useful. That is food that is often thrown out, a tomato that's misshapen or an avocado that's got some brown spots that you don't eat. Well, if you're making guacamole or tomato soup or a salad or it doesn't matter if the tomato looks weird because you're cutting it up anyways. And so rather than throwing those out, there are some grocery stores that are starting to have those sort of imperfect produce available. There's even a program you can get it delivered to your home. That's one of those steps towards reducing our food waste.
Thank you. It is a great question that comes in, as you think about motivating action to move us in a different direction. Do you see the Christian scriptures, or the Hebrew scriptures for that matter, as potential motivations to move people in action, to take action, to care for the common home?
This is a really interesting argument, because when you look at some of the denial of climate change, there's often a religious perspective that's there, and it's actually become the minority, though it has a long voice. So there's actually a great way to using scripture, because if we connect to humans using scripture as stewardship of the earth, not dominion of the earth, but the stewardship piece, it is in scriptures that say that we should be taking care of the animals and plants that God gave to us. So there's a large group in the evangelical church that's working on that kind of principle. Ramanathan mentioned it last week. There's a climate scientist called Catherine Hayhoe, who is absolutely wonderful and has had a niche, both as a climate scientist, who's incredible, but she's an evangelical, and she's worked very much with the church to connect their reading of scripture and their Christian perspective to taking care of the earth. Frankly, the other piece of Laudato Si, which is helping the disadvantaged and the cry of the poor, should be an absolute direct connection to statements in any of the religious texts that you might want to follow that say that you should be taking care of your neighbor and your family. So I do think that there's a strong sense of being able to use religious perspective to bring other people to the table. If they don't follow the science, they can follow their faith and still be part of the solution, particularly in helping the more disadvantaged communities.
Thank you. Next question is, if you could speak a little bit about connections that you see between the current pandemic we're living through and climate change.
It's a great question. I was actually asked to be interviewed by the TV locally on Earth Day last year, and that was the question they asked. So a couple of things. Short term, as I mentioned briefly, the pandemic has caused us to live differently, and in some ways our planet has healed, at least in the short term. As many of you may have seen the pictures of like Venice canals, for example, you can actually see the bottom, and air quality in many major cities has become so much better. So there's kind of this weird positive component of that. The connection between climate change and COVID itself is certainly not established. The connection that comes up sometimes about climate change and disease is really the fact that by changing the climate in some areas, you may be allowing certain of the vectors of disease to move into new areas. And so it could increase people exposed to different diseases, but I've seen no research done that's making a direct connection between changes in climate and COVID-19.
Thank you. Next question is, there's a section in the encyclical about the weak responses. Pope Francis used that term, weak responses. And you've already mentioned a little bit about how you don't believe in climate change. You're a scientist, you know that it's happening, but that's not shared by everybody. So, as a scientist, what would you say, what is the source of that denial? Or even for those who accept it, the ineffectiveness of the response?
Okay, and those are very tightly connected. So Michael, thank you for talking that. There's a group at Yale and George Mason that's been doing this now for, I think it's 12 years or so. There's something called 6 Americas. And what they did is they've surveyed over 2,000 Americans, asking them their beliefs about climate change, their response to a variety of different issues. And what it came down to is that if you look at the US population now, it's not the world population, breaks down to 6 groups. There's about 10% who are complete denial of climate change and nothing changes their mind. Absolutely nothing, no facts, no nothing. There's about 10% on the left end of that spectrum that are so concerned about climate change that it's almost an over-the-top response and everything is climate change related, and they are really alarmist, truly the alarmist. They call us alarmists, we're not alarmists, we're realists, right? Which means there's 80% in the middle that really could do something important. And what you find on the people that are on the skeptical side, the main reason they're skeptical, there's 2. One is, and that was your second part of your question, Michael, is, okay, so what's happening, but did I do anything about it? Can I do something about it? So one of those solutions is providing those suggestions, providing those ideas like, If you do these 3 things, you will reduce your carbon footprint. If you and all your family members do these things, and sometimes people say that encouraging people to do individual action doesn't make much of a difference. In and of itself, that may be true, but if 1 million of you or 5 million of you or 1 billion of you make that single thing, then you've made a major change. And that's one part. For the true deniers, unfortunately, climate change itself has become incredibly political. And because of that, there's been some research data done by psychologists that shows that giving more evidence to the people that are on the right political spectrum and skeptical about it actually reinforces their skepticism. So more information is not the key, which is a big lesson for scientists, because we just want to give you more data and a lot more graphs, and therefore you'll believe me, because if I give you 2 graphs, you may not believe it. If I give you 10, there's no way you can't believe me. So part of this communication is that how do we get to connect to you more? And I will tell you from personal experience and from the success of our projects, we need to connect to people's hearts. It's not just about your head, it's about your heart and your faith and your emotional. So I'll give you a quick story. I was on a bus ride from the airport, from DC to the airport, and I was there with an elderly person from San Diego, and she said, "Why were you in DC?" And I said, "I was there for climate change." She went, "Oh, well, you're one of those." And that started our conversation, right? And then we started talking, and I realized that it wasn't science that was going to convince her. I said, "Do you have a garden?" "Oh, yes." "How long have you lived in San Diego?" "Oh, 25 years. Have you noticed it's gotten warmer at night?" "Yeah, every night I need to turn on the air conditioner." "Oh, what happened to your garden?" "Oh, my azaleas are coming out a month earlier." And so she's telling me her story of 3 or 4 things that she noticed about climate change. And that was a different way of approaching the person. That's one. The second thing is, I think we need to be creative. I have some colleagues I know that are here tonight, teaching 2 or 3 different topics together. I taught with Julia Cancer, bringing sociology and science together. I'm teaching with a colleague in theater this year. We're going to create theater short plays on climate change. So using the arts, this is why I love being at a liberal arts university, using the arts to bring in different perspectives. So the way to reach some of those people is not through facts, it's not through data, it's through the heart.
That's great. Thank you. Speaking about what people can do to take action, there was a question about what a parish can do. Have you seen programs or approaches that faith communities and parishes in particular have adopted?
There's already, I know, some groups in the room here that are doing it in the San Diego parishes. A lot of things, right? They can change their landscaping. And they can start doing things in the church itself. Churches, often being old buildings, are amongst the most energy inefficient buildings. So why not, improve their energy, change their landscaping, make sure they serve food that's organic. I mean, they're probably already doing many of the cry for the poor part of cry for the earth, cry for the poor. I think that's one thing. The other thing is network. If one parish has found a solution, share, because a lot of times people are trying to reinvent the wheel. And so ways where we can sort of share our solutions, maybe coming together, maybe one parish can't afford solar panels, but if 5 parishes get together, they might be able to get a deal to put on solar panels. So think of those kinds of community building ways so that the parish itself as a church, and then the messaging going to the parishioners is, this is why we're doing this. This is part of our contribution to taking care of our common home.
Thank you, Michelle. Actually, I just want to read out a comment that Trey McDonald sent in. He's the director of sustainability at the university, and he encourages us all to think about potentially voting in elections for candidates that support responses to climate change, and also voting with the investments that we make and purchases from companies that are committed to operating sustainably. So yeah, thank you for that, Trey.
Thank you, Trey.
Michelle, because we're getting close to the end, but one of the things Pope Francis talks about at some point in the document, I forget where, is, we all have special places that touch us deeply. And I wonder, I know you, before COVID, used to travel a lot to wonderful places. Is there a place that you think about that you want to make sure that we protect and take good care of?
Wow. That's an unfair question, because I've been lucky enough to travel to so many wonderful places. I think rather than make it my place, I think all of us have that piece of a forest or strands, part of a river, part of a beach. For me, I obviously connect to the ocean, having spent a large portion of my life there. If I had to pick one of the places, it would be where I worked in Baja. We had such a strong connection with the fishing village where we worked. And that's the place where I would really want, and that's why we worked on reducing the pollution, is to having pristine conditions returned so that the people can have clean water and clean beach.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, this has been wonderful. I'm really grateful for those of you who sent in questions. Thank you for that. And of course, thank you very much, Dr. Budria, for your insights, your wisdom, and for couching the difficult science, the depressing science at times, with your message of hope. So thank you for that. My colleague, Dr. Mark Peters, is going to close us out tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Lovette-Colyer. Michael, thank you so much for the beautiful prayer to get us started, and to remember that, as Michelle was finishing, that this is a work of the heart as much as the head and our hands, right? So it takes that holistic approach. So many great questions. It's good to see so many participants here tonight. Please tell your friends that we're going to continue to study this. 1 hour is not enough. And we plan on, sort of culminating all this with talking about what specifically we are doing at USD, but what else we could be doing at USD. And to that end, if I may, just a little self-promotion here. Next week, same time, we'll be exploring chapter 2. We're going through the encyclical sequentially. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the gospel of creation. I know there was a question about, how does Hebrew scripture and the view of creation fit into this? What about Christian ethics and theology and this puzzling sort of conflict that comes when we look at the different perspectives from our faiths. And so Emily Reimer-Barry, our chair, Maureen Day from the Franciscan School of Theology, Father Emmett Farrell, who's been a longtime proponent and currently serves here in the Diocese of San Diego as the director for Creation Care Ministry, and our own Jeff Burns will be the moderator. Michael, you set a high bar there for Jeff, so and Ram and Michelle have set a very high bar for this coming panel, but I am sure that this panel is more than up to the challenge. We hope that you join us. We hope that you'll invite friends to come, and thanks for being with us tonight.
And don't forget Percy Lewis also on that panel.
Oh my goodness, how could I forget Percy? Percy, our first ever tribal liaison and professor of practice ethnic studies, bringing the indigenous perspective and her own discipline to that. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.